I got here very unexpectedly. So I spent 30 years in the chemical and materials area. I ran a business. I was an investor relations person for a public company, all in chemical and materials. And, you know, we didn't use the word sustainability then. We used energy savings and yield, and the word sustainability has expanded quite significantly since then. But we were still very sensitive to resource efficiency, which is a very important part of sustainability. And I like to tell young people about this because they think they have all the new ideas, and they don't. Okay. Things that are good business were good business 25 or 30 years ago, and they're still good business today. But yet we've expanded the thinking about what sustainability means, which is a very good thing. It's a great thing. So I worked in the chemical industry, and it turns out that I worked for a company that was taken over by very big company I won't mention, and I decided it was time to make a change. And I met the founders of Ocean Exchange through networking. And anybody that thinks networking is just a lot of hooey, they're wrong. So I met someone who introduced me to someone who introduced me to someone else who introduced, and like 5, 6 down the chain, I met the founders of Ocean Exchange. And they founded this amazing organization that I'm part of, and we're celebrating our 10th anniversary, and that's why I'm in Florida right now. And it's quite incredible. They had hypothesis, and they had a frustration, and that led to the formation of this. They were very frustrated 10 years ago that many people wanted the microphone, literally and figuratively, and they wanted to complain about what's wrong as it relates to healthy oceans and resilient coastal systems. And a lot of those folks were not really in the solution space, and there was a lot of blame assessing and finger pointing. And the founders of Ocean Exchange were bummed out by that it was not forward looking about how we solve the problems. And they wanted to get out of this vicious cycle of everyone blaming each other. And that's why we were founded. Their hypothesis also was that many solutions exist, and they're buried in universities, and that's part of this conversation, and other research centers, certainly North America, but if you look in Western Europe, Scandinavia, Israel, certain parts of Asia, where a lot of innovation occurs, a lot of it just isn't getting out and having impact. It's stuck. It's stuck for a lot of reasons. And we can get into that later, but they felt that they wanted to form an entity that was optimistic, that helped leverage a lot of the research and early development that had already been done and get these solutions unstuck. Our mission is to help advance the adoption of innovative solutions from startups. We don't look at innovation in big companies, and help it get to market. And it can be a nonprofit as well. I mean, there's some very fine nonprofits, but it doesn't mean they don't have solutions, and it doesn't mean they don't need to be run like a business. They have to think about where they're going to get money, how they're going to deploy, what is their market, all of the things that we think about in traditional business plans. So I met them. I was at this inflection point in my life, and I was very interested in this. And they were not really interested in continuing the operations of it. They wanted Ocean Exchange to continue, but they didn't want to do it right. They were the founders. They had the idea, and it was just karma, good karma. We met at the right time, and we're celebrating our 10th anniversary today.
What is your definition of the blue economy?
Well, I happen to be invited to be on the NOAA subcommittee for the blue economy in 2020. So I'm a big fan, although there are other great definitions of NOAA's definition. It has 10 verticals to it, and I think it's quite robust. And, one can Google what those 10 are, but it gets into some areas that people, I think, in the innovation world don't think about, like tourism. Tourism is one of the biggest segments, and yet it it needs and it wants, and it can accept a lot of innovation. And I know in the North Carolina region, for example, tourism is a big part of its economy, and we'll talk about blue economy. But there are a lot of other definitions, and I also like that the NOAA definition takes into account research. There's a lot of money spent on research vessels, people, equipment. It's hard to sort of set that aside, but what I really like about the NOAA definition is that it gets beyond that old way of thinking about the extractive industries, which are oil and gas or fisheries. It's very broad. We've had a webcast series at Ocean Exchange in conjunction with the National Office of the Marine Technology Society in our this year. And our first one of this series that we did in March, we did an overview of the blue economy, and we had the chief economist of NOAA and another economist, and an awful lot of very, very smart folks. And I'm not an economist, but many people believe that these elements of the blue economy can grow faster than traditional parts of the economy. There needs to be a big discussion about workforce development. There's going to be a dislocation of people who are in maybe some older sections of the total economy. Geographically, some of the blue economy is in other places, and certainly other skills. And anyway, that's my feeling about the blue economy.
That's really good. And I did look up and did a little research on NOAA. They have a strategic plan now too around
the
blue economy. And I can't remember, was health a part of that too?
No, but for some people, materials from the sea, medicine from the sea is a big deal. So there are other groups that focus on that, and it's a legitimate part of it. And I encourage people, don't get hung up on one definition. What I think everyone should do is sort of broaden their thinking about the blue economy, and not get hung up on one definition or another. Although I like the NOAA definition.
It's pretty broad and it's pretty detailed too, which is
Yes.
and very understandable. So how is a concept, once it's been defined, for a community like Wilmington, how could that be of value? How could they use that to kind of work a plan forward for their future?
Sure. I'm probably an outlier in what I'm going to say. So you have traditional economic development people, and what they count are jobs created. And no doubt that's important, right? Jobs are created. People buy a house, they buy a car, they do all those things. They're buying gas and groceries, and all that contributes to the economy. I will also argue that places like Wilmington and others, and believe me, what I'm going to say is not targeted at Wilmington, but they should think more broadly about how innovation that's developed in other places, and frankly, I don't even care if it's developed in the United States, wherever it is, to get companies and entities in their area to adopt it, to make them more competitive. So it's about job creation, and it's also about protecting the big businesses that are in a place like Wilmington. Take the port. And as I say, I think I'm an outlier, but I think that often these local or regional initiatives overlook the power of a big industry in their area adopting technologies from outside of their area to make them more competitive. And that's going to protect jobs in the long run. And that's important in something like a port or any other big industry that Wilmington, tourism, all of that.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And so, and so to do that, do you need some sort of strategic plan? Do you need to have some sort of, collective office that helps with that? What would be the mechanism to kind of help, because Wilmington is pretty isolated. I mean, it's a small community that's pretty insular, and
I know it. I have family that has a house out on Figure Eight Island, so I know Wilmington perhaps more than you might think it that I know about
yeah,
Wilmington. Um, so, going back, what are the assets there, the universities, other things, and how do they map to the blue economy? However you want to define it, right?
right.
But just take the port, as an example. It's a huge asset there. And what is going to advance Wilmington over Savannah or Brunswick, Georgia, or Virginia ports, or any of them, right? But it's a huge asset. So how does that map? And then what is needed for that port to grow? And what are the gaps? And also, what are the things that facilitate that growth, right? I think we often focus on the gaps too much, and we don't focus on the things that can facilitate, that are already there, perhaps. The connection with the university, might be something that facilitates growth there.
I'm
Yes.
curious, with the growing momentum on impact investing, call it what you want,
Yes. Yep.
ESG or whatever, has
Mm-hmm.
that made your, your search for funders and investors easier?
Not yet.
Okay.
I think people are serious about that. And the more the banks or others are going to force them, and the capital markets are going to force them, but I don't think they quite know what that means yet. So I think it's an important trend. It suddenly didn't open a gazillion doors. I see doors cracking open. I think people haven't figured out what it really means. If you look at the corporates, for example, I don't think they all know what that means for them yet. And if you look at some of the funders, there are some that will do concessionary investment, which is, kind of a form of impact, right? Wink, wink. We have a family, they have a mission, and they're willing to take the risk that someone else won't take, or accept a lower return in the long term because they're so mission oriented. And that's a growing trend. And I've been to some family office meetings, and they're all talking about this wave of the next generation sitting at the table of these family offices, and the next generation is demanding to do good and to make a return, because they often have a huge fiduciary responsibility with the money that they're entrusted with, right, for many future generations. So they can't ignore that, but they often say they can carve out something to, for a mission. I think it's evolving. I think it's serious. It's evolving, but it hasn't changed my life overnight.
Talking about the future, when you look out, 10, 15 years, what is that? Well, let's start with, what is that future state that you see for the ocean exchange? And then, what did you kind of learn, or what could be learned from that and applied to Wilmington?
Yes. So one of the big things, and I think it's one that distinguished us from the beginning, and I see it growing, but I see others adopting it, which is great, right? It's great. This is what our world, you and I are talking about, need. 10 years ago, when we were founded and people talked about ocean, the knee-jerk reaction was that it was about conservation. It was save the whales, coral restoration. And I don't want to diminish those things. They're very, very important. Now people are thinking about the economic engine of it all. We talked about the blue economy, and I think that will accelerate. And the trend that I think is so important is that if you only thought about the ocean in terms of save the whales, Then you went to the marine science department in the university, or you went to the oceanography department. And I'm going to tell you that we don't really see the big innovations coming out of the marine science department and the oceanography department. The big stuff is coming out of the engineering departments, all types of engineering, civil engineering, mechanical, bioengineering, go down chemical engineering, go down the whole list of them. And the computer science department. So one of the big ahas that a lot of us had on the NOAA Blue Economy subcommittee was it was about data and AI, and that's going to power an awful lot of stuff. And the real dilemma, the real rub, is if you go into the civil engineering department of any big university, and again, I'm not talking about Wilmington or even North Carolina, and you mention the word ocean to these people, they say it has nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
And this is the big gap. And this is where we're going. If I look out 10 years out, is to try to continue, not start, but continue to be the evangelist that these solutions that are being developed, and public and private money is going into this, and it's being sub-optimized as it relates to ocean solutions, because the people that are doing it never think about the ocean. So I'll tell you this story. We had winners of our $100,000 awards 2 years in a row from an incubator that's in Argonne National Lab. And both of them are energy storage devices. And the example that I'm going to give you, energy storage, we will never use all the renewables that we want to use unless we solve the energy storage dilemma. No one knows how to solve that problem yet. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't blow. Even the wave action, although it's pretty consistent, it needs energy storage to deal with any kind of intermittency of the energy output. And I met some of the smartest people I've ever known that have solutions that deal with energy storage. And when I talk to them about maritime utilization, it's like a curtain went down on their head. Never considered it. I said, could this ever be used on a port or a big boat, a big ship crossing the ocean? Never considered it. Don't know. They're thinking about grid use, either traditional grid, utility company, or they're thinking about off-grid uses, but had never thought about the maritime needs of energy storage. And the decarbonization of ocean shipping is one of the big, hairy, audacious problems that nobody knows how to solve. And one might read a cool article about an electrified ferry in Norway. That's very, very different than crossing the ocean and carrying goods. And if there's anything we've learned in the last year, in the last month, is about our supply chain and how fragile it is and how dependent we are on all this stuff crossing the ocean. But, all that, it's all burning, kind of, nasty fossil fuels, and nobody knows how to solve that problem. So looking forward to try to integrate the needs of maritime broadly into all these smart people. We all pay for this, even at private universities, they're getting federal and state monies, and we pay for this, and it's not helping the ocean because they don't know about the needs of the maritime. And when I talk to folks in kind of maritime industries, they will say, so I will only repeat what they say, is that they have failed to give that market signal over the years. The utility companies are giving a very strong market signal about their needs. You can go through land transportation, has given a very strong signal about what it needs to, disconnect from fossil fuels. Maritime industry, only very recently, and I think they're doing a much better job, but it's a very recent initiative for most of them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think just here in the United States, there's so many people that haven't even visited the ocean. And so the ocean is just this this thing, we can drive around in our states and see power lines, and we can see dams, and we can see roads, and we can't see the ocean, and there's people that wait their way into their adult life before they ever see the ocean. So why should we pay attention, right? And
I would even expand on that. The people that live near the ocean, we have moved our ports away from our residential centers because we think they're ugly, right? They're big industrial things. There might be emissions there. You walk down the street of Wilmington or Delaware River in Philadelphia, or I'm in Florida, and ask how many people want to live next to the port. So we have hidden them from the population. There's none of that public pressure to deal with the ports issues, which are significant. Ports and airports, but let's talk about ocean ports. Most of them are near pretty big population centers, right? And all these ships have to burn fossil fuels while they're in port. They have a lot of work to do while they're in port. And there's a move to electrify the work at ports, but it's got a long way to go. But even people who live near the ocean aren't viewing the port, aren't viewing the industrial activity at the ocean and understanding it, because they're enjoying a very quiet residential life near the ocean, or they're enjoying a tourism experience.
So we talked about the future state. What are some of if there were the top 2 or 3 things that Wilmington should do right now, what should they be doing, and how would they sequence them? And you mentioned, appointing a person full-time, building out a strategic plan.
I would say number one.
Okay.
Getting that full-time person, a leader to do that. I think that's number one. You can have part-time people. You can committee yourself to death with all these groups that get together. It needs a leader who's dedicated, number one. And then I think part of the next thing I would do is really prioritize the industries that are there. And I'm not an expert. I mean, I think of the port, but there are other things there, I'm sure, and tourism is big. And prioritize them. You can't do everything. Strategy is also about selecting what you're not going to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And getting some focus on the top 3 or 5, and figuring out what's going to drive those forward. What are their needs? I'm a real fan of some road mapping and having some off ramps that show today's gaps, and have some serious conversation about how those gaps are going to be filled. And also a off ramp about, as I mentioned, those things that facilitate progress and how to nurture them and make them better and grow them. I think we focus too much on the gaps and won't focus on the nurturing of what facilitates progress.
What about this cross-industry, cross-discipline communication effort, activity that you talked about? Because you're right, there's so many, one industry's problem is another industry's, well, we solved that, a bunch of years ago. How do we do that as a community, or even as as a nation to innovate?
Well, you got to force all those people in a room. So I like to tell stories. So here's a story that I like to tell. So we have this annual event. We give away this purse, and we put together a group of folks, leaders across a whole bunch of different industries. And after the event, I do a traditional survey, but then I call some of them because they're just little things you want to tease out that you can't get in a survey. And for years, we've had people from Boeing that came to an ocean event. Now, Boeing has a big ocean surveillance business today, but what they told me about Ocean Exchange just stuck in my head. And they said, we'll go to a trade show next week, and we're going to see the same cast of characters, the same companies, the same people. I can predict, I'm saying what they would say, I can predict who's going to actually be working that booth at that trade show. We come to Ocean Exchange and we get to talk to people across a whole lot of disciplines. And we find out that we share a lot of commonality that we hadn't thought about. And because we're sort of drawn into just working in our own vertical and only, talking to people in our vertical, that we lose all these opportunities. This week, we, Ocean Exchange, are having a summit in Fort Lauderdale about decarbonization of ocean shipping. We invited a guy from the aviation industry because where do we intersect? We intersect with biofuels. And what's the big hang up in biofuels? I don't think it's so much about making them, although there's some challenges to make them. One of the big hangups is the supply chain. If you are an ocean carrier and you're stopping in South Africa and Singapore and some port in Brazil and all that, you want to burn biofuels, there needs to be a very robust supply chain. Probably those things, the materials are going to be made locally. You're not going to ship the fuels all over. So there needs to be manufacturers pretty near all the big ports where the ships call. Are the source of the biofuels in those areas, right? Is the biomaterial grown near there? And all that has to be thought through. And whether you're flying airplanes or doing ocean carrier shipping stuff, you share a lot of the same deals. So we have a guy from aviation coming to an ocean decarbonization meeting.
That's awesome.
There's just not nearly enough of that.
Yeah.
And you have to force it. It won't happen organically. You absolutely have to force it.
What is your greatest hope for the future?
Oh, I hope that there are more of what Wilmington's going to do, right? And that I hope that everyone that works in these regional and state and local clusters don't view the guy next door as a competitor, and that they view it as an opportunity. The pie, as it gets bigger, will be better for everyone. I'm absolutely convinced it'll be better for the investors, for the startups, for the strategic parties, for the universities. And I see too much competition. And so my hope for the future is that that people can expand their view beyond their county. And that's real, or their state. And that's a hard thing to do. As I talked about, traditional economic development thinking forces people to think narrowly, not broadly. It does. And I think the ones that are going to succeed kind of get out of that mode.